Um, I think Richard is really one of the few practitioners who is not just involved with important buildings in his practice, but deeply also involved with the culture of architecture in a much wider sense through his engagement with the Royal Academy, the RIBA, in many ways with the LSE Cities program and other projects. Tonight, Sir Richard MacCormac is going to discuss 6 of their current projects in the office with us, and really to touch on the whole relationship between the program as well as other inspirations that become the driving influences of these significant projects. Sir Richard MacCormac is chairman of MacCormac, Jameson, Pritchard, and the partnership was founded in 1972 and incorporated in 2002. He has taught and lectured widely and published articles on urban design and architectural theory. He is regularly invited to be an assessor of architectural competitions. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a Royal Academician. He served 2 terms as a member of the Royal Fine Arts Commission and was a Commissioner for English Heritage from 1995 to 1998. He was President of the Royal Institute of British Architects from 1991 to 1993 and was awarded a CBE in 1994. He is Chairman of the Royal Academy Architecture Committee and the Royal Academy Forum. He is a trustee of Sir John Soane's Museum and the Greenwich Foundation, and is currently or has recently served on the RIBA Gold Medal. It just goes some way to show the range of involvement. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the wonderful combination of projects, many of them university buildings, but of course all sorts of other significant buildings, one of which is of course the recent commission that the practice is working on for the BBC. Please join me in welcoming Sir Richard MacCormac.
Thank you very much, Mosen. I'm just going to preface the kind of the slides by trying to sum up what I'm going to say. There are lots of different ways that you can talk about architecture and explain architecture. You can explain the pragmatics of architecture. You can concentrate on the technology of architecture, and so on. In order to speak about 6 projects in an hour or so, I'm going to concentrate on something fairly specific, which is not too much about either pragmatics or technology. I'm interested in technology as a servant rather than as a kind of generator, really. And I'm going to talk about these 6 projects in terms of the genesis of their design. I was educated in the kind of mantras of modernism, and at that time there was thought to be some very, very direct relationship between the so-called function of a building and its resolution as an organized design. And there were these rather facile kind of statements, such as form expresses function. Actually, even when I was a student, I didn't really know what that meant, because it's actually completely meaningless. But John Summerson wrote an essay in the Architectural Review in the late 1950s when he was curator of the Soane Museum. And I remember he asked a question, and I'm sure, knowing Summerson, the question was asked in a sort of tongue-in-cheek, rather ironic way, which was, and I paraphrase, because I haven't found the quote, something like, if the fit between form and function is really an exact one, is there any room for any other kind of expression or meaning in architecture? And that was directed, I'm sure, at a lot of practitioners at that time. And this brings me to the sort of theme that I'm going to try and explore in relation to the projects, which is to suggest that because the fit between the physical requirements of a building and its form are actually generally rather loose, it is possible, more than possible, for ideas of other kinds to validate, in a quite valid way, to drive design, and in doing so to continually extend and perhaps change our understanding of what architecture can actually be about. So I'm going to start with a project actually designed over 20 years ago, built over 20 years ago, which is a student residential building for Worcester College, Oxford. If I could have the lights down and first two slides, please. The view on the left is looking down towards the site where the building was built, completed in, I think, 1983, 20 years ago. And it's quite daunting, really, because it involved cutting trees down and so on, and disturbing a rather idyllic scene. The way that we approached the project was to see this lake in terms of an 18th century picturesque garden. And on the right is the canal at Chiswick Villa, which originally was straight and which was made into a serpentine so that you can't actually see right down it. And what that tradition, that English landscape tradition, is about is creating a sense of anticipation, which is then fulfilled as you come around a corner of a lake or a rivulet and you find something, and then as you find what you suspect is there, you then are led on some other new situation. So I thought that in this project, next slides please, next slide, that we would look at the project in those terms. In fact, the lake was put into the park in the early 19th century, but it's in an 18th century tradition, and it was there to drain what had become a marsh. But the relationship which the lake has to the great quad of Worcester, which you see bottom right and right-hand slide, or both slides, where the Hawksmoor Library forms the kind of loggia into the quad. It is a very interesting one, because you don't know that the lake's there until you've come out of that quadrangle, gone through a little opening, and then you come across it, and it leads you around to the other end of the college, and gradually kind of has this kind of unfolding effect, which is characteristic of that landscape tradition. So to some extent, the 18th century landscape tradition drove this building. Next two slides, please. And the way that the existing buildings, both medieval and early 18th century, handle this sense of unfolding surprises, partly through wonderful kind of Alice through the looking glass doorways and tunnels that suddenly reveal spaces that you perhaps wouldn't have expected if you hadn't been there before. So on the right, we're looking through the loggia, the entrance to the college, at a raised quadrangle of grass. And what you don't know is that just over the end of that is the water of the lake. And the left-hand archway that runs under a raised garden takes you out of that quadrangle on the left, out of sight, on sort of far left-hand corner in the right-hand slide, and brings you into this unexpected park and the unexpected lake. Next, please. So what we did was to make a building that idiomatically is a recognizable as late 20th century building, but it its role in the landscape is, in a sense, an 18th century one. What it does with the terrace at water level is it divides the end of the lake so that the two stretches of water disappear from your view when you're looking down the lake. One disappears into foliage on the left, which you can't see, and goes through a little weir to maintain the level. And on the right-hand side, just out of sight, there's another series of weirs where water is pumped back into the extension in order to aerate it. But basically the game is to give the impression that the water is endless, which is an 18th century way of doing these things. And on the left is the ground plan. It's a student residential building, and the student rooms are clustered 3 to an L shape on each side of a shared kitchen. And the whole building is a kind of L shape. So there's a sort of theme of smaller and larger L-shaped forms, which are stacked. It was pretty complicated to work out, and none of the soil vent pipes went down vertically, but that's not what I'm talking about. It stacks back, and what always surprises me, or almost always surprises me actually, is to draw sections that, for some reason, students, particularly in practicing architects, are quite reluctant to do, because sites, even this site, turned out to have a considerable fall, which allowed us to enter a little courtyard behind the view on the right, and come out through a loggia at a sort of half level up, and to have a room underneath which gives access to the terrace, which you can see there with the white concrete columns, which is half level down. And what that does is it establishes a threshold between the public world of this part of Oxford and the college garden in an exactly analogous way to the loggia underneath the Hawksmoor Library at the front of the early 18th century college buildings. Next. And that's the loggia on the right, and because you can't see the lake when you enter the college's main entrance under the Hawksmoor loggia, you see a raised grass terrace, grass quadrangle, and then beyond it, if you actually walk right up to the end of it, I think you can see over and see the water. We're playing the same game here. If you go up onto the terrace that pushes out rather ship-like, you find the water, and you can actually just see the water there. And this gives you an idea. That's the entrance, little entrance quadrangle. The loggia that we're looking at here is underneath there. There's the raised terrace, there's the lower terrace. It's diagonal axis, which is exactly on, more or less exactly on the axis of the lake. And a series of stacked L's go back. Next, please. At a certain stage in the genesis of the design, I found myself doing something I do quite a lot actually, which is to use words. And in this case, it's a quotation from Louis Kahn. And it kind of led to an idea that the building had some kind of a matrix, some kind of a skeletal core, which was where the circulation was, and a theme of the building which comes very strongly into our BBC project, which is the last of the projects I'm going to talk about this evening, is the notion that circulation is social. It's not just for moving from one place to another, it's actually a place in itself. And the red in that drawing represents the sort of central circulation, and the blue bits, the secondary circulation, going out to groups of rooms. Next, please. And you can make a model of the circulation, which is on the left. And what happens is that the building stacks up in this way, and what the model represents are just the shared spaces, that is to say the circulation and the kitchens. And in the core of the building, here and here, are kitchens. This is a first floor level, I think, and there's a stair there and a stair there, which come up underneath the kitchens. So when you arrive at the top of the stair, that stair's just coming up through there, and you look back into a kitchen, and students who are making coffee or cooking or whatever in the kitchens can see people moving around on the staircases. So the building is a building that really encourages people to meet and get to know each other, because actually otherwise they're sort of very locked into their rooms. And that's become a very important thing to me. Next, please. So that's a kitchen, and the kitchens are like little sort of shops in a way. They have glazing at the ends of them, and that glazing is looking over the staircase, so that you come up and you look back into the kitchen. And that roof light is a table on the roof terrace, which is accessed from the kitchen above, and the step section allows that to happen. Next. And you see it's quite complex. So there's a kitchen in there, and there's a kitchen buried in here with a little terrace out here. This has quite a big terrace. And the kitchen skylight for the kitchen here is the table outside the kitchen there. What we did was to find that there was an existing 17th century wall around this part of the site, and we took that to pieces and put it onto piled foundations, which it shares with the actual habitable space. So there's no construction joint there, and so the building just emerges out of the fabric, reconstructed fabric of the 17th century wall. Next, please. Next. That picture on the left is sort of obviously more recent. It's kind of settled into its situation, and that's a view looking back down the lake from the lower room underneath the raised terrace in winter. That's just gloss paint to get the reflection of water onto the ceiling. I suppose that thinking about this project since we did it, it seemed to me that it's a building that isn't supposed just to be sort of looked at as an object in one take. I'm really interested in the idea that buildings have a narrative possibility to them in the way that the English picturesque landscape tradition was a narrative. The experience was in time. You experience this building in the same way in time, and it controls the narrative in the way I've described by obscuring or revealing its situation. Next, please. Next, please. The next project is a chapel for a Cambridge college for Fitzwilliam. And one of my sort of favourite places in London is the Soane Museum. And I learn something new every time I go there. And what Soane does, this is the dome in the museum behind the house. And then this is the studio where his assistants worked. I wonder at how he did the Bank of England from a studio that size. And that's the picture room at the end, which you know. And then he cuts through and disengages these spaces from each other and drops light down in the interstitial spaces here through skylights, which is a kind of fascinating thing. So in the breakfast room, which is not in that section, the north and south walls ought to be underneath the edge of the pendentive here. But he does this trick, and I think it is his invention, where that north wall is displaced and moved out, not very much actually, all the sort of subsidiary spaces are very narrow, and so it's moved out by probably about 3 feet. And then there's a skylight out of sight up here. And light drops down the edges. And it's both kind of disturbing and strangely calm. And I keep finding myself reworking this idea. And it's kind of inexhaustible, actually. Just about to start a room for St John's College, Oxford, which is probably initially, if you looked at the design, you wouldn't think it had anything to do with this at all, but it does. Next, please. And the building that perhaps most obviously is to do with this is this chapel, and it sits on the end of a residential wing here by Dennis Lansdowne back in the 60s, I think, and forms a kind of end piece. It was his intention in his master plan to do that anyway, but he didn't propose a round building. We had previously built a court here, which goes on as a student residential court. So it's a round object that sits on the end of long rectangular student range. But what we did was to take the rectangular geometry of that range through into the interior of the chapel. There are various kind of ideas here which are ones that perhaps kind of repeat themselves and will come up again. There's an idea of reconciled opposites, which is to do with being under and over, or in an underworld or an overworld in this chapel. An idea of building buildings inside buildings, which Soane did a lot. And some things work on you very subconsciously, and you're not quite sure of whether the influence was there or not. But when I started work on this, I had been to Stockholm and seen the Vasa ship again, and I'd also seen the Viking burial ships in the Oslo Museum. And while I was working on this, a psychologist friend of mine pushed a series of Jungian treatises my way, which were about rites of passage and about the symbolism of ships in world religions. Next. So what this is a building inside a building, and the building inside is a kind of arc, which you see in section there. It's very early drawings here, and that is the deck of the arc. This is the underworld here at ground level, and you ascend stairs here and here, a bit like the stairs in Asplin's Stockholm Library, to get up onto the deck of the ship or the ark. The thing about doing this, I think, is that the ship idea should barely be legible. It should be elusive rather than literal. Next. So the vessel, the ark, is suspended, as it were, in the middle of the cylindrical space, and it's suspended off a rectangular structure which consists of precast polished concrete columns which support a rectangular kind of baldacchino, and there are light timber and glass roofs which span from that structure out to the cylinder on each side. And the cylinder's broken both east and west, so you get the big west window. And the underworld has very rough white concrete, which gradually transforms through grit-blasted concrete blocks into highly polished concrete. Next. And it was while developing this design that a friend of mine, a doctor, a psychologist in Bristol, sent me these images of Christ in a ship, and we fell into a conversation about ship symbolism, and how many world religions use the ship as a symbol, And then there are other kind of symbols like the Jungian symbol of Jonah and the whale, the night, what he called the night sea passage, burial ships, and of course the word nave is Latin for ship. But that was kind of curious because it was coincidental. I started this process, I was already conscious that we were developing an idea about a ship before I was alerted to this imagery. Next, please. Next. So this is the entrance from a kind of narthex. Originally, in our master plan for the college, that's never been fulfilled. We had a kind of route all the way around the inner part of the college, and you would have gone through this kind of cloister. You're looking into the entrance and into a kind of crypt space, and there are little details like the vertically cantilevered tubes here which support this horizontal glazing system have got low voltage spotlights in the top, and there's this game where you don't want any sense of support from this transom of the underside of the boat. The underside of the boat is planked. There are 7,500 stainless steel screws, and the grooves in the screws line up east-west in every case. The contractor did not go bankrupt, but it wasn't very profitable for anybody doing this kind of stuff, I can tell you. Next. And the ship sort of is fragmented where it meets the structure. That was incredibly difficult to resolve. There's the light wooden roof with kind of wishbone struts. It's probably something to do with Alto's roof at San Salo, supporting these radial ribs, and then glass there, and a nice detail by the project architect putting a little curved oak plank under there so that you don't see the flashing, the sort of mouldy flashing that you necessarily would see otherwise. Next. Yeah, very nice effects of light on the north wall. Next. And by some amazing serendipitous kind of chance, there's a great tree which is exactly on axis, which we catch between these two glazing bars here. And there's a secret staircase that comes from the crypt for the chaplain or for performers that comes up around the end. But of course, part of the purpose of that stair is to do this disengagement, this kind of Sonian disengagement of the deck from the perimeter. The deck doesn't touch. The three staircases ensure that the deck doesn't touch the perimeter. It floats free. Next. And then at the west end is an organ that we were commissioned to design, working with the organ maker Collins. Apparently to have doors on organs is very, very popish, and I had a lot of trouble with people who were very low church in this college. But I managed to persuade the organ maker to admit, which was true, but he was totally reluctant, that the doors have a certain resonance in the range of the organ itself. And we got them just. But they're very declamatory. Sort of rather think of some kind of angel, an Epstein kind of angel doing that. Next, please. Okay, my next project, which is quite sort of son of, in some ways, of the chapel. There's a little building about the same size that we did for the University of Lancaster. It's called the Ruskin Library, and it houses the Ruskin Archive, and it's a place of scholarship. It has a reading room which can seat about 12 scholars. It has exhibition space, and it has an archive which contains, under controlled conditions, most of the artifacts and books and photographs and drawings that Ruskin either collected or indeed wrote or drew himself. These are two images that were important to me during the project. One is a cathedral, Albi, and Albi, the Albigensians, or whatever they were called, were heretics, and they built the choir in their cathedral here of stone as an inner keep within the cathedral, which was defensible, so that if they had to defend themselves, they could first of all use the cathedral as a fortress. It certainly looks like one, and then they could go further into the refuge of the choir itself, which was kind of fortified stone building. And that interests me enormously when I saw it. The idea of, again, this idea of building within a building. On the right is a William Burgess cabinet, which, as you see, it's got dormer windows. I enjoyed Burgess's kind of playfulness in making objects that are like little buildings. They're rather childish in a way. They're both furniture and small buildings. Next, please. So, what this building consists of is an outer sort of fortification, if you like, which are the two arcs. I say fortification, I mean it has to be incredibly secure. The collection is priceless, so that's a real issue. And then within that is a keep, in which the archive, the Ruskin archive, is kept. The word keep, in this case, can be applied as both a verb and as a noun. The building is a kind of keep, and you enter it from the university side across a kind of causeway, which is made of white concrete paviers, and you come into a space that is glass with slate set into it, and these are kind of there are lots of kind of metaphors in this building, and this keep is made of red Venetian plaster and is in a sense Venice rising out of the water, or these are canals going past it on each side. It's also a kind of church. This is a narthex, this is the choir, and this is the reading room, which is secure, which is the sanctuary. And what I tried to do with this project was to engage with Ruskin's essay, The Lamp of Memory. My client was the professor of English at Lancaster University, who was terrific, a guy called Michael Wheeler, and he was a great Ruskin scholar. And he engaged me in a very, very exacting discourse about Ruskin's idea of memory and Ruskin's idea of that architecture should be historical. And what I've tried to do with this building is to make it a building that is unexpected, and you haven't been in a building like this before, but at the same time I hope it's oddly familiar in the sense of it being church-like in the way I've just described, and the sense that the archive is like some great sort of treasure chest or reliquary or ark. In fact, in the office we kept, next please, we kept inventing new kind of words for it. Next please. For the archive, even the corpus of Ruskin's work was a kind of nice one. And then we thought, it's almost Ruskin's kind of great tomb in the middle of the building. And that actually sort of chimed with something that was on at the time I was designing this, which was Richard Serra's exhibition in what is now Tate Britain called Weight and Measure, where he put these huge rusted steel objects in the Duveen galleries, which in a sense displaced you as a visitor around the objects. These are just two of many kind of initial ideas for the building, where the archive was across rather than longitudinal, and you had somehow to get through the archive to get into the reading room. And we went through various geometries, triangles, rectangles, squares, circles, and eventually the ellipse. Next. Sometimes if you can make an incredibly succinct model, you kind of know you're getting there, and this is a very early model with the two arcs of the outside envelope made of thick bent cardboard. The galleries are for exhibitions made of black card with a bridge going through the archive, which is a Venetian red piece of timber, very carefully milled and painted with a Venetian red paint. And the cut here, compared to the Fitzwilliam Chapel, is very narrow. And in the model, that was gilded, and there was a lot of gilding proposed, which didn't exactly fit the cost plan. Next, please. That was a sketch I did on a sort of bit of napkin in a 4-hour journey from London, from Lancaster to London. Probably we didn't spill wine over that one. We generally spilt wine over, which actually sums it up rather well. And that's it on the right-hand side before there was any landscaping. Next. And at night you can see the inner keep is lit up as a great object, and it comes up. It's 3 stories high, and one story is in the basement, because if I just go back on the right-hand side, please, could you do that? Yeah, you can see that actually we're on an escarpment here. So that's a service door from the perimeter road, and people come into the building above, but the archive goes right through the glass floor. Next, which is, yes, thank you. And next to early drawing of mine on the left. Again, you can't see beyond. I like the way the archive object stops you seeing the end of the building. And an artist we worked with quite a lot, Alex Belashenko, eventually took over this image here, and we found a daguerreotype of the northwest portal of St. Mark's, and that's, unfortunately I haven't got good images of it from outside, sits in there behind these doors. Next. That's looking on the right, looking out through the archive, through the daguerreotype image, which has been expanded from 200 millimeters to 4 meters in height. Next. On the right, one of the canals, as it were, which run along the side of the archive goes through, rather blue lighting underneath, very watery, slightly like the Aqua Alta. Sort of, you feel the building's been flooded, and the steps that bring you down from this gallery on each side, just for playfulness, go on under the water to suggest that the level of the floor is 3 rises too high. And then this bridge of wood and glass penetrates through the archive, and actually on the left-hand side there's a meeting room that you can get access to. Next. The archive has a window in it which looks out 5 miles to the sea at Morecambe Bay. That window is for the meeting room for the trustees of the Ruskin collection, and we're looking back in the sort of sanctuary scholars' reading room at the very heavy structure that has insulation on the outside, and then that's held on by these Venetian plaster panels with oak pieces with little bronze connectors in the intersections. Just there. Next. And a curious thing actually that happens at some stage during the project was our realization that this word keep had more to it than we had perhaps expected. This is the first major archive that is passively has passive conservation. The combination of a large volume of air, a heavy external structure, and a heavy archive allows us in the summer to maintain the temperature by drawing air through the building at night, through fans in the roof to cool the building. The only part that is occasionally air conditioned is the reading room, because the reading room has more humidity because of human occupancy and so on, and has to chase the archive occasionally. Next, please. Right. This very different project. This is the Jubilee Line station at Southwark, and in an odd way, it might be related to the first project I showed, because the way it's organised underground is as a kind of underground landscape of anticipated events, which are developed in a sort of syntax of expansion chambers and sort of pipe connections, which are generally escalators. It's like a very large-scale piece of underground plumbing. But I'll come to why I've included that image on the right in a moment. That's the cyclorama which Schinkel designed as amongst other settings for the Magic Flute. That's the Queen of the Night. She's suspended there. I went to Berlin, I think probably 2 years ago, and found that this set is in repertory. It may not be the same set, but it is used. The Schinkel sets are used, and it's the most wonderful surprise. I learned about it from the V&A exhibition of Schinkel, probably about 15 years ago. Next, please. There are two entrances to the underground, one from this corner on Blackfriars Road, with a sort of reference to the Holden stations, one from the interchange from Waterloo East Station here, from the overhead railway. So you come either in here or in here, and then you come into one of these expansion chambers. Well, the ticket hall is an expansion chamber. There's a small one here, and then this big intermediate concourse. When you're standing there, which is there, you can tell where you've come from, where you can go. And I've not done any kind of survey, but really interested to know whether people can hold this station in their mind's eye. You know, I've lived in London all my life, and I don't think there's any central area underground station that I could conceivably hold in my mind's eye. I think Waterloo you nearly can, with the Bakerloo on one side and Northern Line on the other side. The others are completely confusing. And I hope this one is incredibly simple, really. That's what we intended it to be. That point there, you're either going down there, or you've come from there, or vice versa. And that's it, really. Next. Next. So that's the ticket hall, which is the first big expansion chamber. Next. That's the little pivot that changes your direction to go down the escalators to the intermediate concourse. Next. This is a model that the artist Alex Belashenko, who worked on the Ruskin, made of the intermediate concourse with this glass cone, part of a cone. It's an elliptical cone, actually. Next. And that's what it's actually like, and it's top lit. And those are the escalators going back up to the circular ticket hall. These are the edicts, as they're called, edicts, which are going down to the running tunnels and down to the lower concourse. Next. And that's looking up the escalators from the lower concourse up towards Alex's work. There's a strange way in which its geometry is dislocated somehow and drifts past the view. A number of children I know have picked up this thing and have said it's just like the sky at night. When I was doing the project, you don't tell project managers that that this is based on Schinkel's stage set for the Queen of the Night. You do not do that. But when the station manager said that it was like a stage set for a night cyclorama in a theatre, I told him what it was, and then he said, well, you know, we use this station now on Sunday afternoons as a concert hall, and London Sinfonietta play here, and one of the works that they play is called Up the Line, and apparently it was specially composed for the station, which I thought was fantastic, and I hadn't heard this at all. Siobhan Davis, the choreographer, wanted to use the station before it was open for her dance company. That sadly didn't come off. Next. And that's the lower concourse. The sort of game is to confound the idea of being underground. It's just the opposite of a lot of stations like Ian Rich's or Michael Hopkins station, where as you go down you have more sense that you're kind of digging into rock. Here it remains very evanescent all the way down. Next. Now, my penultimate project. This is the welcome. This is what I'm going to talk about. Is the welcome wing extension to the Science Museum. I'd become interested in memory theatres. Memory theatres were, I think, a classical invention, but certainly used in the Middle Ages before the advent of printed information. And what they were visualizable arrays of information. The one I show here is a round one, but apparently they were often rather like a theatre, and you went into the theatre on the stage, as it were, and the tiers of the theatre had the information in them, and which was labelled and classified. And they were mnemonic devices. They were devices to allow you to remember relationships, philosophical relationships or relationships in natural science. The novelist A.S. Byatt actually has written very interestingly about the idea. Apparently she invents memory theatres when she's writing a novel, and she uses the spatial structure of the memory theatre, her personal memory theatre, to allow her to visualize the structure of the novel. In this case, what I wanted to do was to make a building that you entered, as it were, on the stage, and what you saw was a series of tiers, and they didn't classify the information. I mean, the Natural History Museum attempted to classify natural history in a Linnaean way, which was a complete disaster for obvious reasons when it was built. So it was a sort of obsolete model. So there wasn't any attempt to classify it, but the idea was to actually give a very immediate sense of what was available in the building, rather as in the GLE station, you're able to understand where you are very, very quickly and very, very easily. And on the left is a drawing that I did right at the beginning of the competition. I think it's half true to say that when I'm doing competitions, I don't read the brief for quite a while. It must sound incredibly reckless, and it probably is, because we lose lots of competitions. But the brief, you often get a brief that's really thick, and it's full of incredibly turgid information, of which just one or two salient issues are going to be important. So I drew this thing, which is a sort of Ron Heron kind of archigram, kind of sort of spaceship monster, walking a city, whatever, sitting in a blue space. And of course, my colleagues working with me said, oh, come on, what's that about? Let's get on with the competition. Next, please. And at a certain stage, what had started as rather like other parts of the Science Museum, where you have galleried spaces with courts, glazed courts, sort of atrium in the middle. That's the fairly conventional arrangement that you see in the galleries that go back towards the welcome wing, which is the name of the wing we did. I, for some reason, possibly to do with that first image, I don't know, thought of inverting that and putting the spaces in, again, it goes back to building objects or suspending objects inside a space, like in the chapel, that you'd suspend the exhibition spaces. And the sketch on the left, very early sketch, is a sense you come in on the stage, and there are the tiers of the theatre. And I brainstormed the name of this project with a colleague, not an architect, an arts manager, and he said, if you haven't got a name for it, you're never going to get anywhere in this competition. And I sort of had names like the Ark of Science, and eventually we titled it the Theatre of Science, and that really pressed buttons with the Science Museum. The other thing that happened was that having kind of produced, well, we got further than that actually, when we went to visual artworks, virtual artworks, I mean, and they amazingly decided to put the kind of theatre in the sky like that, and that really set me off. Next. And so that's the section with the 3 trays. I mean, this is very big, actually. It's about the size of 4 tennis courts. And that was that was the kind of space it turned out they wanted. And at the time of doing this, I'd got very interested in certain artists, people like Yves Klein and Turrell and Robert Irwin and Dan Graham and Anish Kapoor and so on. And I wanted the envelope, rather like that first drawing I showed, of a kind of object standing in a sort of sky space. I wanted the envelope to be radiantly blue, but I had no idea how to do that. Next, please. And the object that appears in that first drawing, the first drawing I showed on the left-hand side, turned out to be the IMAX cinema, which we floated in the space, hung off gerberettes, which all the structures hung off gerberettes. And what we're looking at right-hand side is, ignore the yellow patch, that's something to do with a particular exhibition area. There's a huge floor plate. You enter here, and that's just one huge exhibition area. Next to. And then as the thing goes up, that's the first of the first floor plate, which is enormous, and the top one is quite narrow, and the section is gradually filled by the IMAX rake, and what that does is creates a raked space that goes up through the building, which is about 40 degrees, and it's quite interesting. We've now done this in a commercial building. You can actually get very dramatic kind of raked open space, which is much more comfortable to look at in some ways than a vertical one. Next. Turrell on the left, a kind of early work, 1970s work, fantastic work really, very disturbing. And Irwin, who works in fabric, was working in fabric at that time, they were collaborators, but that's a fabric scrim in front of a white painted corner of a room with sunlight coming through here, I think. And so, next, what we developed from not knowing what this blueness was here were fabric panels by Architen, the fabric makers down the Mendips. And they're backlit by continuous lighting behind these battens which tension the fabric with reflectors that are designed precisely to cast a completely even light up each side of the space. And at the end of the space is an enormous blue glass window, which is 33 metres square, which has 10,000 solar louvers in it, 33 metres long, and some perforated metal on the outside with cleaning walkways between the window and the perforated metal, which can reduce summer sun from 60, 70,000 lux down to 50 lux. Museums and galleries commissioned standard, which was a piece of research, next please, which we did with various laboratories through Europe actually, but particularly with a Dutch lighting group I work with a lot, working now with me on the BBC, a guy called Roger van der Heide. And these were experiments with the fabric, how it was going to work and so on. These were experiments to see whether the ambient light levels of exhibiting at 250 lux would kill this, and there's a slight sense that it has compromised it in the actual museum. Next. That's the top floor, that's the top of the big blue window there. And that's the first floor, yeah, it's the cafeteria. And the other theme, in a way, is as a sort of diaphanous quality. This is the underside of these massively structured suspended floors with their gerberettes here cantilevering out. Is made of an industrial grillage called Orsagrill, which allows us to sprinkle through the floor, allows people to walk around resurfacing within the floor depth. The floor is 2 meters deep, so there's a sort of interstitial world there. Next. And then the IMAX cinema, similarly clad in this material. The foyers and staircases in circulation are not revealed to you as you enter from this point here and come in underneath, because you're looking very obliquely at this material. It's only when you look back at it that it becomes transparent. And I've become incredibly fascinated by the ability of building membranes, if you like, building envelopes to behave in very unusual ways. Next, please. Okay, the final project, which I think sort of has quite a lot of things about it which I've already talked about. I think what happens to us as designers is we kind of accumulate strategies and tactics which we have to keep re-employing in various ways as we go along, and hopefully we get sort of better at it. I don't know. I find design as difficult every time I set about it as I did more or less when I was a student. So our site at Broadcasting House, probably everybody knows, that's Broadcasting House itself. And everything around here is going to be demolished. The buildings on this site have now been demolished. So Broadcasting House is the sort of tip of a very large new building, very, very large indeed. And that's All Souls. And the centre of the block here is almost exactly on the axis of Upper Regent Street, with the spires, you know, on the centre of that axis, which offers an extraordinary opportunity for creating what I might call a kind of urban cyclorama behind the church. And there are various sort of themes in this, underworlds and overworlds, and the kind of preoccupation that I have to a certain extent with what I'd call reconciling complementary opposites. So what's happening here, one of the things that's happening here is that this is a stone convexity, a solid stone convexity, a kind of promontory that faces south in quite an assertive way. And we've made another one here, which is stone, but whereas the axis of that is north-south, this axis is skewed, so that curve is exactly related, tangentially as it were, to the flank of the church, and the end of this and the axis within its construction is aligned to the church. So it deflects. What's the word? It's sort of genuflection to the church, and this concavity here is complementary. It's made of glass and it hangs. So the stone stands on the ground, more or less, and is convex, and the concave, complementary but continuous part of this sort of sinuous form is a kind of opposite. Next, please. Oh, sorry, just going back on that side. That was what the BBC started building on the right in 1938, and the war broke out, and they stopped it. One of the reasons we did get a planning consent, I think, was that this was always the kind of scale that was intended. Okay, next, please. Now, another theme that I want to sort of bring into this, which perhaps relates back to the Little Worcester College building, is the notion of circulation space and shared space being itself creative space, active space, space in which transactions occur. And there's a kind of model for this, which I've talked about elsewhere, which is the notion of looking at sections through the West End of London and looking at analysing what the streets are doing. And sometimes the streets are what I'd call highly transactional. They have shops on each side, or pubs, or restaurants, or even frequent front doors of houses. Other streets which have offices in them are not very transactional. The transactions are going on in the offices, and they're kind of transactions with other offices elsewhere or with other media or whatever. And the market, the street market, is the most intense kind of local transaction. So I wondered whether, in thinking about a broadcasting organisation, one could transfer this perception of the city as being a place where there are certain sorts of transactions going on. In the case of the BBC, it's the creation of broadcasts which don't have anything to do with the man in the street and are kind of hermetic worlds until they're released into the sound waves. And then between the production areas where those things are going on, next please, there might be kind of interstitial areas, and this is a very early kind of sketch of mine before I started designing it, wondering whether there was some kind of space where the divisions or the broadcasting divisions would overlap in some kind of way. And that led to a very simple diagram, really, which that's Broadcasting House, diagrammatically speaking. That's new development to the north, and that's a replacement to the east, churches there. And this is this interstitial area, next please, which developed into a route right across the building with openings into production areas here, and into the new development here, and into Broadcasting House. Basically, that's the diagram. And in a way, the building is quite conventional, because it actually has to be recognisable in the property market as a office building to have value. But there is a very special, there are a number of very special parts to it, which this is one. This is a very early sketch of the concave effect of the end of the cyclorama that's looking out towards the church. Next, please. And that has now translated into the scheme that's being tendered at the moment, with this route going across. And it's quite difficult to explain, but there are double height spaces here which interlock with double height spaces here. These are cafeterias here. And these little areas here and sort of around here, lots of little breakout areas. So the idea is circulation, next please, is where people meet. And you've got 3,500 people in this building. Almost all the vertical circulation, almost all the lifts are coming up onto these, what we call the marketplaces or thoroughfares. And they alternate with these double height spaces where the floor goes right up to the concave end of the street, and with these kind of passerelle-like spaces with some little sitting areas off them. Staircases, we've negotiated a fire strategy, a means of escape strategy, that allows the stairs to be open. So the stairs become part of this, and discussions with people working in the BBC has led us to think of the stair landings as meeting places. So we're making the handrails turn into shelves, and landings big, so that people can put their personal computer or their briefcase or their file down on the shelf and talk, because just looking in this place is where a lot of the business goes on. So I see all the circulation, what I call recreational space, at the very core of the building, where the local transactions in an intellectual sense occur. Next, please. And at the bottom, we've got a transfer structure that transfers the load of the middle production building onto 4 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, here, to open up the centre of the lower ground floor as the newsroom, which will be shared by television news, radio news, and the World Service. The World Service, all the radio divisions are coming here, and the World Service's lease runs out in Bush House, so they're coming here. So it's all radio, apart from television news, which is very synergetic with the other news services and uses the same journalists. Next, please. And then running through the scheme is something of the scale of a 19th century arcade that connects Portland Place through to East Marylebone here, connects this new space behind the church into the circulation, with a new foyer to the radio theatre, kiosks, little shops, perhaps an internet cafe there, an exhibition area here, a cafe suited with the radio theatre here, and various breakout spaces for conferences and so on, which are suited with the radio theatre. So it's a very public building, and it engages with the public realm, with the public world, in a way that it doesn't at the moment. And the receptiveness of this space, embracing the public, is quite different to the Reithian sort of sense of, you know, you enter here if you're wearing a tie, a bit like the RIBA. Next, please. And we're working up a program of collaborations with artists here, which is just beginning. Two artists are in this audience who either have been or hopefully will be involved. These are images of ours about how this glass facade, the concave facade, might behave. This concave facade is printed with a 70%, roughly 70% print in an interlayer, which is the same tonality as Portland stone. And it's etched on the outside in a syncopated relationship with the printing, so that it's not a shiny, transparent, modern movement facade. It'll look quite opaque during the day. If you throw light at it at night, it'll go opaque. If the light levels inside exceed the light levels outside, it'll go transparent. Next, please. And the person we're working with on this project is Martin Richmond, and these are two installations of his. There's one in the RIBA about 10 years ago, and a sort of singular work here. Next. And this is still us rather than Martin. This is us experimenting with how the facade might behave at night. According to the blue is the screen to the north of the so-called thoroughfare, that circulation, which is an 8-metre high screen, which is either going to be lit blue or made of blue glass. So that there's a strange kind of nocturnal feel about the building at night. Next. And that's either it on the right during the day, or at dawn, or on the left, maybe it's a combination of daylight and some floodlighting on the outside, because it's incredibly variable. And what we're going to do is we're going to work with this Dutch lighting group and calibrate all lighting conditions so that we know exactly the light levels and levels of illuminance internally to get the effects we want. So we can quantify it, and then we're able to specify fittings and so on in a kind of objective way. It's too complex and ambitious to leave to intuitive chance. Next. This is a wonderful artist called Pete Hull who draws for us, and I think this gives a very good idea of what this is like. Here's the stone on the new promontory. That's that Portland stone that's very highly fossilised. That's smooth Portland stone. This is Broadcasting House smooth Portland stone. And this is the glass hung, coming up, and then it runs across the attic of Broadcasting House to replace the slate mansard roof, which is known as the cat slide. So we can unify the two buildings together. And this is trying to pick up the sense that tonality of this glass is equivalent to the stone here during the day. And that's the promontory that faces the church, which is talking to this. There's the post office tower. And we're working with Jean Plantzer, a Catalan artist, to look at a spire of light that comes out of the centre of that promontory and talks to this spire and this spire. The spire of light comes out of an inverted glass cone that's metaphorically been driven through the top 3 floors of the building. Next, please. and that, yes, the spire of light will appear sort of there, and that's probably the best kind of rendering of the building in twilight, and that's the more sort of quiet, formal stone facade on the Portland Place side, and the kind of glass attics, a roof that goes across and unifies the whole composition. Quite a good word, composition, I think. And this piece talking to this piece here, and Hayes Davidson did one trick here in order to that this can be seen. The church has been moved about 15 yards, 15 meters east. Thank you very much.
Take some questions?
Yeah.
Hopefully we can have some questions. Maybe I could start with one quick question, because I think what was really interesting is the issue of the relationship between different ideas and their impact on the formation of the various projects. And what I'd like to ask you is whether, in fact, apart from the particular things that have influenced the projects, to do with the brief, to do with other sources of inspiration, whether there are other kind of overriding elements that have changed, in a sense, the nature of your practice. Before seeing the BBC building, it seemed to me that somehow the earlier projects with Oxford, the use of, if you like, more traditional materials, were now being supplanted by more infrastructural materials, in such as you used in Southwark and with the Welcome Wing. And even with the first images of the BBC building, I was sort of thinking that it was still in the continuation of that tradition. And then you showed the artist's rendering. And the artist's rendering somehow returned to the use of the stone, the idea of materials that were quite different from the metal and glass use of the. So, very long way of asking a question. How do you feel that there are particular things outside of the specific smaller scale elements that are really changing the nature of your practice? And if so, what are they?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer that, I think. I think that architectural practice is a journey that is unpredictable. We're told that we must have a business plan, and I'm sure that's a very sensible thing to do. But I'm also sure that whatever it is, it won't turn out like that. I mean, I think that what happens to you as an architect is that something comes along that you never expected, really. And I suppose I think our practice is quite peculiar. I'm quite interested in the responses to that, because we don't fit into any prevalent architectural tradition in the UK, really. I mean, we're not high tech. For a long time, our projects were quite domestic, and they were made of brick and wood and that kind of stuff. And then we moved into precast concrete, and now we've moved into steel. And we don't have an idiom, we don't have a signature, and that's wonderfully liberating. Except that, of course, it's kind of risky in a sense, because we're always having to develop new technological understanding. That's a big responsibility. But I suppose that the Jubilee Line station changed everything, really, one sort of go. I mean, we generated a new kind of imagery for a station that I couldn't have anticipated that we would ever do. And then the Welcome Wing of the Science Museum kind of, that's just a big box, really, a sort of magic box. It's a crinkly shed on the outside with a blue end to it. And that was something quite different. So I suppose the repertoire has got more and more varied, really. And the BBC, and there is this continuing influence of artists, and the sense that actually architecture is liberating itself from having to make up excuses about what it's about, that it has to be programmatic, it has to be technological, it has to be functional, and blah, 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 and all those crutches that the modern movement had to have in order to justify what you were doing, particularly with the Treasury or whatever, And I think we're in a very, very interesting, all of us, a very interesting situation now where I can start to talk about architecture in a much freer, more, frankly, more honest and more creative kind of way. And of course, working with an organisation who has, the BBC, who have a massive output which cannot be measured in any way at all in terms of productivity or efficiency or value, monetary value. It's just a cultural product of the most astounding kind. That is fantastic experience for us because they see us in the same way. We can go and spin these stories to them, and as long as we're within the cost plan, ho ho ho, that they'll go for it, and they're just great people to work for. So we've got sort of bit of a sense of freedom actually, which is really nice. Does that kind of answer the question? No, it doesn't, does it?
No, because I think it does, but you're returning to the kind of circumstantial in the end.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that another way of answering the question would be that when the thing is so liberating, because you are neither high-tech nor kind of low-tech, so to speak, you have more pressure on you because you have to construct what is it that you're doing simply because of the fact that you are liberated.
Yes,
so,
it's more difficult.
So it is very difficult.
I mean, well, yes, and the thing that perhaps we architects don't say enough is that you can't do any of this stuff without really good engineers. Right. And with the Welcome Wind Science Museum, there were key people in Arabs who helped us develop the structures for that. And I enjoy working with engineers a lot. And the transfer structure over the newsroom in the BBC project, I mean, that's a fairly amazing piece of engineering actually, because it's quite shallow, and that's Whitby and Bird, and these people are absolutely key to being able to deliver this stuff. And in the same way, these ideas about light and so on, they come from going to the James Turrell exhibition or the Yves Klein exhibition or whatever, but then they have to be kind of mediated by people like Roger van der Heijden in Amsterdam to try and find how you can do it. And that's all new stuff.
Anybody else? Any questions?
Tired everybody out.
It seems to me there is a difference between the earlier
Can you just wait for the mic? Yeah, that's fine.
Just a comment to follow up on Moisten's question. There seems to be somewhat of a progression in the work. The first Worcester College, it's units which are repeated in a system.
Yeah.
Very Wrightian in a way. And then we get a kind of singular building, but also a system, kind of, you could say it's somewhat Carnian, the way you discipline the things, sort of architectural flowers. But after the tube station and the welcome wing, you're making a singular object which you can't break down in these ways. And the BBC, again, while you've brought a system into it, there's only a limited degree to which you can do that. It seems to me there is a kind of progression in terms of your ordering principles in the works you've shown.
Yes, I mean, well, I suppose if you're doing a project like the Worcester College project, it's actually made up of little bricks, really, little pieces, which are student rooms, and then they're assembled into L shapes, and then those L shapes are assembled into a big L shape, and there is a kind of thematic idea that's to do with kind of a game with increments that get bigger and bigger and bigger. Of course, it has quite a lot to do with all kinds of things I haven't mentioned. It has to do with Sinat Saleh, the raised place, and it has to do with those fabulous courthouse schemes that Utzon did in the 1950s, which I think just remain absolute masterpieces to me. But then you get into another kind of situation where you don't have it. You leave the whole idea of repetitious units and their composition. You try and find some new principle that can guide you. And the principles may be very, very different to each other. Doing an underground station is about a sort of spatial narrative, which is something quite different, really. And it's making that narrative coherent and making the episodes relate to each other rather in a rather musical or theatrical way, I think, actually, or like an exhibition. I mean, I did an exhibition at Tate Modern, the Surrealist exhibition, about 18 months ago, and that was a very similar sort of issue, really, where you made a narrative out of the exhibition's themes and manipulated it in terms of light and space. And that's something has kind of grown on me. I'm still not answering the question, am I? Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And I hope that the BBC project turns out to be as great as it looks now in the computer renderings and in the models. And I hope you'll come back and show us the final results with all the lights and all the artists.
Another 66 years.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. What's astonishing is how the nature of the practice must be changing just for you to keep pace with the scale of it.
Yes, that's why I'm having this. That's why at the moment I'm I'm just in conversation with the team doing the BBC all the time. That's any way I can do it. Actually. Yeah.